All right, folks, good morning. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday. I hope you're all well. I hope it's not just the coastal fringe that is getting some of this delightful rain that we're having here in Sydney. I hope that's spreading its way westward. I suspect possibly not, but at least there's some rain somewhere, I guess. Not great for everyone. Anyway, today we have Adam Shapiro here from the ICAC. Who's actually come to talk about a recent report that was produced by that organisation, which is about some emerging issues and state of play in the New South Wales public sector. Adam, over to you, mate. It's all yours.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for deciding to spend a bit of time with us this morning. I'm just a little bit of my background before I start so that you know where I'm coming from. So as Aaron said, I'm from the Independent Commission Against Corruption. I work in the Corruption Prevention Division, and my role is largely to manage our training program and come out and deliver workshops around the state to local government and government departments, state-owned corporations, etc., which I've been doing for the last 11 years. What I'm going to be talking to you about today are some emerging issues and the state of play in New South Wales public sector. And this is based on a publication that we put out late last year, which is available on our website if you're interested in having a look at it in a bit more detail. It's corruption and integrity in the New South Wales public sector. So basically what we did was a bit of research to see what the current state of play is, and also try to pick out some emerging trends and emerging issues from a corruption prevention perspective. So I do encourage you to jump into our website and download that and have a bit more of a read if you're interested after today's presentation. So let's get started. So how does Australia rate? Well, interestingly, and probably not surprisingly, Australia rates pretty well in the world. We're in the top 10% of countries as far as corruption, integrity and transparency go. One of the disturbing things, though, a disturbing trend over the last couple of years is that Australia is just one of 8 countries that has experienced a significant fall, a statistically significant fall, in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. And so what that means is that people are starting to think that we are a little bit more corrupt in Australia than we were a year ago, and a little bit more than we were a year before that. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that we are more corrupt as a country, but it does mean that people are starting to possibly lose a bit of faith in that. And when you think about that from the point of view of a public authority trying to do its business, one of the things we really need to be doing is creating a good reputation for ourselves, a deserved good reputation for ourselves, of course, because that assists us in getting on with business and doing what we need to do, and it also creates more of an environment where corrupt conduct is seen as unacceptable. So that's a disappointing statistic, and one I hope that we can collectively improve over coming years. So let's have a look at some of these systemic factors that have been identified during our investigation. So as part of our research, we looked back at our past investigations to look for issues that arise frequently. So some of the factors that do stand out are poor management of information, and ultimately poor management of information can result in all sorts of poor outcomes, including, of course, corrupt conduct. There's the possibility of leaking information, tipping off contractors on what's coming up to give them an advantage and so on, perhaps warning people about rezonings, etc., etc. So that's one issue. Of course, unfettered discretion and unfettered authority have long been issues when we see corrupt conduct occurring. And really what we're looking at there is people having often end-to-end control over a process with very little involvement or oversight by anybody else. And that, of course, creates opportunities where people can make decisions that favour themselves without anybody else noticing. And then we have governance failings, and these are failings of the governance systems that we have in place to ensure that things are operating as they should be. Some of those governance failings are around things like poorly designed audit processes, senior managers not being on top of what's going on, and so on. And when we think about where our corruption efforts should focus, we're looking at processes really where individuals have the ability to exercise unilateral control over key decisions and where information can be obscured or manipulated. So we really need to be focusing on things like information integrity. So, how reliable is the information? How trustworthy is it? Is it intact? Has it been manipulated by somebody on the way through to the decision maker? Do we have enough information to be actually making a credible decision? And so on. And when we are depending on information that lacks that integrity, then that of course can lead us down the pathway of just straight out poor decisions, but also gives increased opportunity for somebody to act in a corrupt, dishonest, improper way. Now, the other thing that we have, it has become very apparent to us is that the climate in a workplace makes a huge difference to the likelihood of corruption occurring. And the sorts of things that can impact on the climate, or, some people would prefer to use the term culture of the place, is that it poorly designed processes, create, a sloppy work environment where people basically do their own thing, do whatever they want to do. And then, of course, we do have organisations where perverse incentives have been put in place that can lead to unintended consequences. So I suppose the most standout of those would be the situation where we seek more money than we necessarily need to do a project because we want to make sure that we get enough money. And then, of course, if we were to run that project and find that we didn't need all of that money, then there is a perverse incentive in place to really spend that money anyway, so that it is not knocked off our budget the next year around. And we also see, as we saw in the Banking Royal Commission not that long ago, that certain incentives, often financial incentives and other incentives, can drive aberrant behaviour. The beautiful thing about key performance indicators, of course, is that people achieve those things usually when there is a KPI associated with them. Of course, the unfortunate thing about KPIs is that people tend to achieve them, and unfortunately, they may well do so by any means necessary. And that's where we sometimes see aberrant behaviour kicking in. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have key performance indicators, but what I am saying is that we need to be alert to the kind of behaviour that those key performance indicators may be fostering. So we've just got to be very careful about, what those KPIs are, how we're expecting people to achieve them, and making sure that they're being achieved in appropriate ways and not inappropriate ways. But the whole issue of incentives is something that's worth unpacking, particularly when we're engaged in activities like procurement and so on, where of course there are a range of incentives in play for the contractors and suppliers that we're using. Obviously they need to make a profit, but they, the other incentives of course are to not do too much work, not do more than they should be doing and so on, to make that a profitable endeavour for them. So how the I guess the feel within the organisation is an important one. If we are fostering a culture where we put up with poor behaviour, where we put up with people acting inappropriately, where we don't apply the standards of behaviour that we expect of people, then we shouldn't be surprised when they act in those inappropriate ways. Now, whistleblowing is another thing that we looked at as part of this report. I think the first thing that we need to highlight here is that whistleblowing is really the #1 method for detecting corrupt conduct in this state. I can't overemphasize the importance of whistleblowing. It is absolutely essential that we foster a good response to whistleblowers, that we are supportive of whistleblowers, and that we enable them to come forward without fear, wherever possible, to report wrongdoing that they may spot. Of course, corruption and other wrongdoing is identified through other means, audit, etc. But whistleblowing is the big one. Now, some of that whistleblowing may come through complaint channels, and some of those complaint channels may not necessarily be conventional. So social media and other technologies are, starting to be more commonly used. I guess they have been for quite some time, really, and it's really a question of us collectively coming to terms with the fact that people do use social media and other methods to make complaints. And because it's not a conventional channel that we are used to dealing with, it can be, those complaints, those issues can go unnoticed or unattended to because of their sort of informality. So some of the common mistakes that we see are things like disregarding information that comes from those unofficial channels. And we do that at our peril because, of course, just because a complaint or an issue has been raised through an unconventional channel doesn't mean that it doesn't have merit, and we do need to be pursuing those things. Another common mistake that we see in relation to whistleblowing in particular is that when people in organisations are mounting an investigation into some sort of wrongdoing, they fail to incorporate whistleblower protection measures into their investigation plans. And it's absolutely essential that we look at the impact that our investigation may have on a whistleblower and build into that investigation ways and means of protecting those people. Now, of course, protecting whistleblowers is not only about maintaining anonymity, and it may not be possible to maintain anonymity, and anonymity only has a certain level of protection around it, but we still also have to be looking at maintaining confidentiality around the information and the process of investigation, but we also need to be looking at the need possibly for whistleblower protection, for witness protection and so on, and building into our investigation plans and assessing where risks may lie to whistleblowers as we're going through our investigation process. Undue influence is another area that we looked at as part of this project. And we identified a range of areas where undue influence appears to take place. The first one being the interference with the appointment of a decision maker. Now, obviously, if somebody is in a position to influence the appointment of a decision maker, that may then put that decision maker in some sort of compromised position where they owe that person a favour, which could undermine their ability to be impartial in their decision making. Of course, we do find people interfering to the extent where they are trying to get their favoured person into that position, or somebody they can easily manipulate, or somebody who is of like mind. So we do need to be careful that when we are appointing decision makers, we are getting the best person for the job without that kind of interference taking place. Of course, when people are trying to exert undue influence, they may well do so through the provision of false information designed to interfere with our decision-making processes and designed to skew our decisions in favour of their interest. Some people, of course, will attempt to go forum shopping. Now, by forum shopping, what I'm referring to is people trying to seek a forum where they can have their issue heard, discussed, decided upon in the most, well, in the easiest way for them to get what they want. So they may find that the easiest way to get what they want is to have a particular person look at their issue, or the best way to get what they want is to have it heard by council or through some other mechanism. And so they look for the easiest place to get the answer that they want. If they don't get the answer they want in one place, they go looking for the next place until they get what they want. And it's just something that we need to be alert to. Now, of course, people use, in order to exert undue influence, they'll use personal connections that they have to try to secure access to decision makers, to secure access to information, and to secure access to different forums that they might want to have their issue heard in. So that's those sorts of personal connections and the conflicts of interest that may arise are something that we need to also consider. Then, of course, we have the hiding of lobbying activities. And lobbying is an interesting area because, of course, we often think of lobbying as only being related to elected officials and, you know, lobbying councillors or other members of parliament, etc., to try and get them to vote in particular ways or to be pushing particular policies and so on. Now, of course, lobbying may not just be of elected officials, it can be of decision makers within an organisation, and it may even be at a lower level than that, but just lobbying influences of decisions. And sometimes those lobbying activities are, you know, are disguised, are hidden, and that is something that we need to address. There is also the possibility of lobbying from within the organisation to advantage one's own interests. So you may well find that somebody outside the organisation is using their personal connections with people within the organisation to lobby on their behalf. But you may also find that individual people within the organisation are lobbying others within the organisation to ensure that decisions are made in their personal favour. So this is this whole undue influence, the whole lobbying area is something that you know, we're looking at in some detail at the moment. We've got a project running on that at the moment. So that's undue influence. Now, conflicts of interest, of course, are a perennial issue. They remain a very significant issue. I can't think of a case of corrupt conduct where there hasn't been some sort of a conflict of interest at the centre of it. Now, what we commonly see in terms of conflicts of interest is a failure to properly manage these, and that comes from a whole range of reasons. You know, the usual ones are, you know, people don't realise they've got a conflict of interest. They don't believe that their conflict of interest is significant enough to actually warrant managing. They believe that because they're a professional, you know, you should just trust them and they should just be allowed to get on with things because they'd never allow their personal interests to, you know, disturb their professional decision making. And of course, you know, corrupt people don't tell you they've got a conflict of interest, they just get on with it. Now, what we often find is that a conflict of interest, whilst it might be identified, there may be issues around how that conflict is then managed and how, you know, that whole process is governed. You know, is there any transparency around it? How are reports made? How are they dealt with? What mechanisms are put in place to manage them? And of course, a conflict of interest declared at this point in time will have a certain nature. And then as circumstances change over time, the impact of that conflict of interest may be greater. So you may start off with a conflict of interest that fits into the less than significant, you know, non-pecuniary interest arena. But then as time passes and there is greater involvement perhaps of a particular person or supplier, contractor, whatever, within a process, that grows from being a less than significant one to quite a significant interest. And of course, the management strategy will change in association with that. So we have to have that ongoing monitoring to make sure that we are keeping up with the changes associated with that conflict. Now, of course, conflicts of interest arise in a huge number of areas. You know, to name a couple, of course, procurement and human resources. Of course, procurement is probably the single biggest area that ICAC investigates, and HR would be probably the largest area we get complaints about. So those are two big areas that we need to be concerned about. Now, the emerging risk, I guess, that we've identified around conflicts of interest are to do with the gig economy. So it's now much less uncommon for people to have secondary employment. It's much easier now for people to set up small businesses. It's very easy to get an ABN. It's very easy for people to set themselves up in a small business that just operates on the side. It's, you know, I guess what it's known as, I guess, as a side hustle, where people have got their little side job, maybe 1, 2, 3 or 4 of them on the side, where they're just making a bit of extra money. There are very low barriers to entry. It's easy to get into. And when we also couple that with things like temporary work, people having pressure to find and retain work, particularly as we outsource more and more things, where people have work for only, you know, relatively short periods of time and need to actually keep paying their mortgage and so on, that unfortunately can increase the possible motivation for corruption. And of course, when people are doing, you know, extra jobs on the side, there is the potential for people to start doing those pieces of work when they're at work for you, rather than when they're at home or when they're not actually at council. So that whole conflict of interest area is something that we continue to need to work on and to work with our staff on to make sure that conflicts of interest are identified, that they are appropriately managed, that we document what goes on, so that if there are complaints, then those complaints can be addressed, and we have transparency around that, so that people know that we're dealing with these issues and managing them appropriately. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that HR issues are amongst the most reported things that we get. So about 25% of matters that get reported to ICAC are related to hiring, firing, and performance management. And a lot of that a lot of that is around things like favoritism in recruitment, which is a very, very significant type of conduct, corrupt conduct that is reported to us. Now, one of the other issues to do with recruitment and HR generally is resume fraud. I've got some examples there up on the screen for you. Some of the various types of or examples of resume fraud cases that have seen the light of day. These aren't specifically ICAC cases, but it's you can see, I guess, how prevalent these things are in our society. Now, resume fraud is common, and the reason why I've got 3 little red people there is that, you know, 25 to 30% of people who apply for jobs in this country do so with a fraudulent CV, which is a quite disturbing statistic. I think 3 out of 10 people presenting you with a CV that has untruths in it, things like falsified qualifications, falsified references, falsified work experience, to name a few. And the really disturbing fact there, you know, apart from the fact that people are getting jobs sometimes on the basis of these fraudulent CVs, is that you know, numerous investigations that we have engaged in have featured weaknesses in employment screening that have fed into the corrupt conduct. So there's 6 just off the top of the head there, where poor background screening was an issue. Operation Evoca, for example, the person of interest there was an engineer, and he managed to get a job in a couple of local councils, regional councils, on the basis of a false CV. So he did have the qualifications he claimed, but he'd written his own references. He had falsified his work experience and so on. And then a number of other cases where, and the most recent one would be Operation Tarlo, where the person of interest there, Iman Sharabim, was found to have engaged in corrupt conduct in association with, misusing funds that were provided to her NGO and using those funds for personal use. But she also claimed to have had a PhD, which she didn't have, and so on. And so it's important that we do understand that resume fraud can lead to other corrupt conduct occurring, because of course, had somebody done the employment, more detailed employment screening on some of the persons of interest in these investigations, they would not have been employed in their corrupt conduct. It's highly likely they wouldn't have been employed, and then their corrupt conduct may not have occurred, which of course would be a much better outcome. So some key considerations around that are that, resume fraud is common and it's costly, and it's not that expensive to screen against it. So, it's a bit of a false economy to try and save that money by not doing the screening. We can use a risk-based employment screening approach. We don't screen everybody for everything. You screen people for what's appropriate for the role they're in, but you also need to think, if somebody changes from one role to another, do we need to do some additional screening to make sure that they are still appropriate? We also need to be screening non-permanent staff and also contractors. We are still relying on them to be trustworthy and honest, and to provide us with good advice and to do good work for us. Simply not screening people who aren't permanent is problematic. We also need to make sure that somebody's assigned the responsibility for screening, because if there isn't somebody assigned to do it, highly unlikely it'll be done. And there is a skill set associated with it. Managing privacy and resource issues needs to be done to make sure we can do it right and manage the issues there. And there are some good practice, better practice methodologies out there that you can use. It's also, and as I said earlier, implementing some post-employment screening is appropriate, particularly in certain jobs where people go from having no delegation to having a delegation, or move into a regulatory role or something like that, where there's a higher risk associated. We have put out a paper which is available on our website, which looks at employment screening. So if this is an area of interest to you, I strongly encourage you to go to our website and have a look at that. Now, procurement and contract management continue to be significant issues for us, and I think it's about 50% of our investigations now relate to procurement and contract management. And it's the usual players often. False invoices, so that's invoices for work that was never done, or inflated invoices, order splitting to avoid scrutiny and to avoid having to go up into a different delegation level and avoiding oversight. Giving contracts, of course, to friends and relatives, we still see. Unwarranted direct negotiations, so where people are engaging in single source arrangements or direct negotiations that are unnecessary and unwarranted in the circumstances, largely so that people can give favourable treatment to a preferred supplier or contractor. Now, we've also got some emerging issues and things that we're seeing a bit of a trend in, and that's where we see the blurring lines between the public and private sectors. So as we outsource more government functions and we bring in more contractors or advisors, either to run projects for us or to provide us with technical or other expertise, and those people float in and out from the public sector back to the private sector, in and out of the organisation. There is a blurring of lines, and there is often a confusion, particularly in those who've come from the private sector, about what their obligations are, about what it is to be a public official, and where issues of particularly conflict of interest might arise. And so that is something that we do need to be particularly alert to. We are certainly seeing an increase in the reliance on the private sector to perform core government functions such as policy development and developing business cases and managing supply chain, hiring staff, managing projects, delivering public services. And as more and more reliance is placed on the private sector, that can leave us in a vulnerable position, particularly if we have lost the internal expertise around performing those functions, and then find it very difficult to judge the adequacy or the performance of the private sector in doing those jobs for us. It can leave us in a position of being able to be manipulated, of being able to have favouritism working its way into business cases and so on, to favour businesses outside the organisation. So we have to be alert to the conflicts of interest that might arise when we're getting private sector people to do those sorts of jobs for us, and also making sure that we maintain an adequate level of knowledge around that business to be able to judge whether or not we are getting what we paid for out of these suppliers and contractors, and making sure that they are providing us with good quality advice that's going to lead us down good decision pathways. So there's also, I guess, an increased use of delivery partners. So partnering with private sector to deliver services. And so those delivery partners might be private businesses, non-government organisations, and so on. And I guess the important thing that we need to consider in those scenarios is that the interests of that private sector delivery partner may not align 100% with your agency's needs or the public interest, in that for, at least for private businesses, their incentive is going to be around, and their interests are going to be around company profits and so on. And even a non-government organisation who's set up to service the needs of a particular community, for example, they're going to have the interests of that community as their primary focus, and not necessarily, which doesn't necessarily align with the public interest. So we've got to be alert to those mismatches of interest and make sure that we can at least be aware of where that divergence might be, and try to manage any issues that could arise there that could lead to corrupt conduct, as well as just bad outcomes generally. There's also often a lack of awareness in these organisations that they are actually under ICAC's jurisdiction when they're performing public official functions, and so that's something that needs to be made aware of. The conflicts of interest that inevitably arise there is also important to remind them of and for us to have in mind. And then, of course, there is a lack of familiarity with the public sector, what our policies are, how our procedures operate, what our customs are, what our values are. And that sometimes at least stems out of poor induction of those people and poor training of them, and a failure on the government side to adequately communicate our expectations of these delivery partners we might be using. We also give these delivery partners access to confidential information, and we really do need to be alert to misuse of that confidential information. So there have to be significant controls around how that confidential information is accessed, what people are permitted to do with it, and having hopefully some means of determining whether or not they're using that information appropriately. Now, one of the other areas that particularly relates obviously to local government is issues with regulatory decisions. Now, some of the problems that we see popping up are the competition between trying to regulate an element of the industry or regulate an element of the community versus economic development in an area. So, of course, a local council has an interest in ensuring that the local economy is vibrant, and but it also has the requirement to be regulating how certain businesses function and so on. And those two, the regulation versus economic development, can clash. And then it becomes a question of which one of those two things will win. Is it that regulation and compliance will take second place to economic development, or will it be the other way around? How do we get that balance right? We also have, the balance of regulating activities in an area and also providing good customer service. Because of course, good customer service and regulation can sometimes come into conflict with each other. So we again have to be looking at how do we do the regulation in such a way that we meet our regulatory obligations and our compliance obligations, but that we do so in a way that doesn't destroy the customer service experience. But we don't want, happy customers to lead to poor regulatory outcomes. So we've got to manage that very closely, and we do see that as an issue. Then there's of course regulatory capture. Regulatory officers becoming captured by the interests of the people or bodies that they are regulating, or the activities that they're regulating, and that's a very real issue. People in those roles can become captured and can start making potentially biased decisions, maybe without any intent to be biased. But then, of course, that bias can become a corrupt bias in the right circumstances. And obviously, we don't want bias to be interfering with good regulatory outcomes. So not only do we need to be ensuring that people are not acting, that regulatory officers are not acting corruptly by, inappropriately applying compliance regimes and so on, but we do also need to be alert to the fact that they may be, sort of almost accidentally, unintentionally acting in a biased way because of that capture. So either way, it's a bad outcome if we allow that to occur. And then, of course, when we're looking at regulatory decisions, fractured oversight, of course, can create loopholes. And we've seen that in past investigations where you've had perhaps, two or more councils or other entities being responsible for things like, asbestos, management of asbestos waste and so on, where there can be fractured oversight, which can create cracks in the system that allow corrupt people to act inappropriately. So we do need to be ensuring that our oversight is robust, and that particularly if we have a joint oversight role with other organisations, that that we're all on the same page about who's looking at what, so that we don't end up with the situation of more than one organisation looking at one element and neither organisation looking at another. So we need to make sure that there aren't those loopholes, that there aren't those cracks in the system. So that's pretty much all that I was going to talk about today. If you would like any advice on corruption issues, you can of course call our corruption prevention advice line. So that's on 02 8281 5999. That's the ICAC main number, and you just ask to speak to somebody in corruption prevention, and you'll be put through to our duty officer. We also have lots of information on our website, and if you'd like to receive information from the Commission about things we're doing and so on, then just visit our website, and at the bottom of the page you'll find a little subscribe function that you can visit. You probably can also see on the system my email address, and I'm certainly very happy for people to send me any questions that they might have, and I'll answer them myself, or I'll pass them on to a colleague to answer if that's more appropriate. So thanks very much for your attention today. I'm just wondering, if anybody has any questions at all, I'd be certainly very happy to. I can hear you.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, does anyone have any questions?
That sounded like a resounding nothing there, Aaron.
Well, I'll upload this presentation probably by the end of the day today. Everyone will be able to see this final slide with your contact details there if they do have any questions they'd like to forward you. Also, the report that Adam talked about at the start of the presentation was the one I shared with you when I shared you the meeting details for this morning. I'll send that around again once this is uploaded and ready for everyone to watch back. Adam, thank you very much for your time this morning. I really appreciate you coming along to Webinar Wednesday to chat to us about this subject. It's really interesting, some interesting things, always plenty to keep eye on there, especially when it comes to probity and conflict of interest, and just making sure that all your processes are in place, and making sure that everything's above board. So thank you very much for that. Folks, we'll be back in 2 weeks, I think. Who have I got up next? It is, let's have a look, see. I've got Daniel Yallop from Morrison Lowe, who's coming to chat to us about impact of changes in the waste sector. Adam, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
All right, folks, enjoy the rest of your day. I will chat to you later, no doubt.